The winter of 1847 came to Thornwood Manor like a quiet thief, stealing the last warmth from the countryside and leaving in its place a crystalline kingdom of frost and shadow. And on the night of the Marquis's annual ball, the great house rose against the darkness like a jeweled crown set upon the frozen earth, its 100 windows blazing with candlelight that spilled golden across the snow-covered grounds where carriages lined the drive like dark beetles, waiting to disgorge their glittering passengers into the warmth within. Inside, the grand ballroom stretched vast and magnificent, a cathedral to wealth and privilege, where 3 chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls of crystal, each bearing 200 candles whose flames danced and flickered in the draughts that crept through the tall windows, despite the roaring fires in the twin marble fireplaces at either end of the room. Frost had painted elaborate ferns and flowers upon the glass, nature's own artwork competing with the hothouse roses that perfumed the air from their silver urns. Roses forced to bloom in winter, beautiful but somehow wrong, their sweetness carrying an undertone of desperation, of things made to exist where they ought not to be. The orchestra played from the gallery above, sending down waltzes and quadrilles that swirled through the room like audible silk, and beneath this canopy of music moved the cream of English society in their winter finest. Gentlemen in dark evening coats with starched white cravats, ladies in gowns of velvet and satin in the deep jewelled tones of the season, burgundy, forest green, sapphire, blue, their necks and ears and wrists adorned with diamonds that caught the candlelight and scattered it like promises. They laughed, these privileged few. They gossiped behind painted fans and made alliances with meaningful glances. They danced and flirted and schemed, and yet, beneath all their warmth and gaiety, there lay something cold, something as frozen as the windows against which the winter pressed its white hands. For this was a world built upon appearances, upon the careful architecture of reputation and the precise mathematics of fortune, a world where a single misstep could send one tumbling from grace into the outer darkness, where the unfashionable and the unfortunate dwelt in permanent exile. The laughter was real, yes, but so too was the calculation behind each smile. The diamonds were genuine, but they adorned hearts that had learned to weigh affection against advantage, to measure love in pounds sterling and acres of land. And as the night deepened and the frost crept further up the windows and the candles burned lower in their crystal prisons, the ballroom of Thornwood Manor became something more than merely beautiful. It became a stage upon which destinies would be written and rewritten, where lives would change in the space between one dance and the next, where the cold without would meet the cold within, and where, before the clock struck midnight, 2 souls who had armored themselves against the world would find those armors tested as never before. He stood apart from the glittering assembly like a shadow given form, Alexander Blackwood, the 6th Duke of Ravensmore, a man whose very presence seemed to draw the light toward him, only to extinguish it in the depths of his dark eyes. And as he surveyed the ballroom from his position near the frost-touched windows, one might have mistaken his stillness for boredom, his silence for arrogance, when in truth both were merely the visible symptoms of a soul that had learned long ago that to feel too deeply was to invite destruction. At 32, he possessed the kind of face that artists longed to paint and mothers warned their daughters about all sharp angles and aristocratic bones, a jaw that spoke of stubbornness, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile, and those eyes, those infamous eyes, dark as a winter midnight and twice as cold, eyes that had seen things they could not forget and had chosen, in consequence, to see nothing at all. The whispers followed him like faithful hounds wherever he went in society. They spoke of the duel he had fought at 23, of the opponent who had not survived it. They murmured of his vast fortune and his vaster indifference to the marriage-minded mammas who paraded their daughters before him season after season. They hinted at darker things still, at a family tragedy 3 years past that had transformed a merely reserved young duke into this glacier of a man who attended balls without dancing and conversed without warmth, and looked upon the world as though it were a performance, staged entirely for his contempt. What they did not know, what no one knew, was that beneath the permafrost of his demeanor lay a landscape of grief so vast and so treacherous that he dared not venture into it himself, for there at its center stood a grave marker bearing a name he could not speak, a date he could not forget, and an accusation that no court of law had ever leveled, but which he pronounced against himself with every breath: guilty, guilty, Guilty. Asterisk. She would have been 21 this spring. Asterisk, he thought, watching a young woman in a white gown laugh at her partner's jest, and the thought was a knife sliding between his ribs with practiced ease, familiar now, almost welcome in its reliability. His sister Catherine had loved to dance, had lived for music and poetry, and the thousand small joys he had thought frivolous until the day she was no longer there to embrace them, and he had built his walls from the rubble of that loss, stone by stone, until the man he had once been, the man who could laugh, who could love, who could imagine a future worth having, lay entombed behind them as surely as Catherine lay beneath the cold earth of the family cemetery. The Marquess approached to offer pleasantries. Alexander responded with monosyllables precisely calculated to end the conversation. A hopeful debutante manufactured an introduction through her desperate mother. He looked through her as though she were made of glass and excused himself before she finished her curtsy. This was his armor, his fortress, his frozen kingdom of one, and he wore his reputation for cruelty like a cloak, because cruelty kept people distant, and distance kept them safe, safe from him, from the destruction he carried within him like a plague, from the curse of caring for Alexander Blackwood, which had already cost one innocent soul her life, and would never, he had sworn it, claim another. In the far corner of the ballroom, half hidden behind a marble pillar garlanded with winter greenery, Eleanor Ashford stood in her borrowed gown of faded blue silk, and watched the glittering world spin past her like a carousel she was not permitted to ride, and she thought, as she had thought at every ball and assembly and garden party she had attended in her 24 years, how strange it was to be so present and so invisible, to stand among hundreds of souls and be seen by none of them, as though she had been rendered in watercolors while everyone else had been painted in oils. Her gown had been fashionable once, perhaps 5 seasons ago, and her aunt's maid had done her best with needle and thread and desperate hope, but no amount of clever alteration could disguise the truth that Eleanor Ashford was poor in a room full of rich, plain, in a sea of beautiful, and utterly without the connections or fortune that might have compensated for either deficiency. She had learned long ago not to mind it, or rather, she had learned to tell herself she did not mind it, which was not quite the same thing, but served well enough on nights like this, when the music was lovely and the chandeliers cast their golden light, and she could pretend, for a few hours, that she was merely an observer by choice rather than by circumstance. Asterisk, there is freedom in invisibility, asterisk, she reminded herself, watching a diamond-draped countess sweep past without so much as a glance in her direction. Asterisk, freedom, to see truly, to think clearly, to exist outside the cage of constant performance times, and yet, even as she formed the thought, she felt the familiar ache beneath it, the hunger she had never quite managed to starve, the longing to be seen, truly seen, not as a poor relation or a convenient companion or a cautionary tale of fortune's cruelty, but as herself, as Eleanor, as the woman who memorized poetry by candlelight and dreamed of Italy and believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that somewhere in the vast machinery of fate there existed a place where she might matter. She had been pretty once, or so her mother claimed, before worry had sharpened her cheekbones and sleepless nights had painted shadows beneath her grey eyes, before the weight of her family's slow collapse had settled upon her shoulders and carved its history into the serious set of her mouth. But prettiness had never been her currency. In any case, her father had seen to that, gambling away her dowry before she was old enough to understand what dowries meant, leaving her with nothing to offer the marriage market but a quick mind, a quicker tongue, and a pride that refused to break, no matter how circumstances conspired to bend it. Her gaze drifted across the ballroom, cataloguing faces and futures as she always did, until it snagged upon a figure by the window, a tall man standing alone in a pool of shadow, his dark eyes scanning the room with an expression of such profound detachment that she felt, inexplicably, a kinship with him, this stranger who also stood apart, who also watched rather than participated, who also wore his isolation like a garment tailored precisely to fit. And she wondered, with the idle curiosity of the perpetually overlooked, what manner of walls he had built around himself, and whether they were fortress or prison, and whether he knew, as she was only beginning to suspect, that sometimes those two things were exactly the same. The touch upon her elbow came soft as a whisper but carried the weight of a death sentence, and Eleanor turned to find her aunt beside her, Lady Harriet Ashford, whose face had been painted with rouge and powder into a mask of desperate gaiety that could not quite conceal the terror flickering beneath. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, Eleanor felt the familiar cold dread settle into her stomach like a stone dropped into still water, because she knew that expression, had learned to read it as a sailor reads storm clouds, and whatever was coming would not be survived easily. "We must speak," her aunt breathed, her gloved fingers tightening with an urgency that would leave bruises. "Privately, now, before it is too late," and she drew Eleanor deeper into the shadows behind the pillar, into a pocket of darkness where the candlelight could not reach, and the music became a distant, mocking memory. And there, with the frost blooming on the windows like flowers made of despair, Lady Harriet told her niece the truth that had been hidden from her for months. The debts had grown beyond all hope of repayment. The creditors would wait no longer. Her father's final shame, a forged signature on a document that could send him to prison and destroy what remained of the family name, had been discovered and was being held like a sword over all their heads. And her mother, dear fragile mother with her weak heart and weaker constitution, would not survive the scandal. The physicians had made that abundantly clear. The shock alone would kill her as surely as any blade. "There is only one path forward," Lady Harriet continued, her voice cracking like thin ice beneath too great a weight. "One chance, one hope, and it stands across this ballroom wearing black and looking as though he would rather be anywhere else in the world. The Duke of Ravensmore needs a wife. Eleanor, his solicitors have made inquiries. He must marry before the year is out or forfeit some provision of his inheritance. And he has rejected every diamond of the season, every beauty, every fortune, but perhaps a woman of intelligence rather than ornament, a woman who would not bore him or pursue him or expect what he cannot give." And Eleanor listened to her aunt weave this gossamer fantasy of salvation, while her heart turned slowly to ice within her chest, because she understood now what was being asked of her, understood that all her dreams of being seen, of mattering, of finding some small corner of the world where she might exist as herself, had been rendered irrelevant in the space of a single conversation, and what remained was only duty, only sacrifice, only the impossible task of capturing the attention of the coldest man in England before the clock struck midnight on her family's last hope. And she looked across the ballroom at that dark figure by the window, that shadow made flesh, and thought, asterisk, so this is how it ends, not with poetry but with transaction, not with love but with necessity, asterisk, and she felt something precious within her quietly surrender, some final flame of girlish hope extinguishing itself beneath the weight of what she must now become. She moved through the crowd like a woman walking toward her own execution, each step measured and deliberate, her heart hammering against her ribs with such violence that she half expected the other guests to hear it, to turn and stare at this pale creature in her faded gown, who dared to approach the dragon in his lair, and with every pace that closed the distance between herself and that dark figure by the window, Eleanor felt the weight of her family's fate pressing down upon her shoulders until she could scarcely breathe, until the glittering ballroom seemed to narrow and dim around her, leaving only the path forward and the man at its end. This Duke of Shadows who held her future in hands he did not even know, were outstretched. She paused at the edge of his solitude, close enough now to see the sharp line of his jaw, the way the candlelight caught in his dark hair, the absolute stillness of his posture that spoke not of peace but of vigilance, of a predator who had learned that the world held nothing worth pursuing and much worth avoiding. And for a moment her courage faltered, her voice died in her throat, and she thought, times I cannot do this. I am not brave enough, not clever enough, not anything enough, asterisk. But then she remembered her mother's face, thin and grey against white pillows, remembered her father's trembling hands and broken pride, remembered that she was all that stood between her family and the abyss, and so she drew one shaking breath and spoke into the silence that surrounded him like a moat. "Your Grace, I wonder if you might." And he turned, those dark eyes finding her with an expression of such complete indifference that she felt herself reduced to nothing, to less than nothing, to a speck of dust that had dared to land upon his sleeve. And his voice when it came was low and cold as the frost upon the windows, cutting through her half-formed request with surgical precision. "I wonder if you might spare us both the tedium of whatever scheme has driven you to approach me, miss." He paused, his gaze travelling over her plain gown. her unremarkable features, her obvious lack of fortune or connection. Whoever you are, as I have neither the patience nor the inclination to participate in yet another transparent attempt at entrapment by yet another desperate family. The words struck her like blows, each one landing precisely where it would wound most deeply, and she felt the hot flush of humiliation climbing her neck, staining her cheeks, marking her as clearly as a brand. But somewhere beneath the shame, beneath the desperate terror of failure, something else stirred, something ancient and iron-forged, something that had survived her father's ruin and her mother's illness and 4 seasons of invisibility, something that refused, absolutely refused, to be dismissed so easily by a man who knew nothing of her, nothing of what she had endured, nothing of the cost of this moment. And so she lifted her chin and met those cold, dark eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both, and said, "Eleanor Ashford, Your Grace, and I assure you, I have no schemes, merely a foolish hope that even dukes occasionally remember their manners." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or the faintest ghost of interest crossed his features before the mask of ice resettled into place, and he regarded her for a long moment before speaking again, his tone unchanged, but his attention, she realized with a small shock, now fully upon her. "One dance, Miss Ashford, and then you will trouble me no further. That is the price of ending your obvious pursuit with dignity and tact." She accepted with a nod, her wounded pride wrapped around her like armor, and thought, asterisk, so this is how salvation begins, not with hope, but with humiliation, asterisk. The orchestra struck the opening notes of a waltz, and the Duke led her onto the floor with the air of a man performing an unpleasant duty, his gloved hand taking hers with no more warmth than if he had grasped a piece of marble. And yet, when his other hand settled upon her waist, when the music swelled and their bodies began to move in the ancient patterns of the dance, Eleanor felt something shift in the very air between them, some charge like the tension before a summer storm, and she became suddenly, acutely aware of every point where they touched, the pressure of his fingers against the small of her back, the heat of his palm bleeding through the thin silk of her glove, the mere inches of candle-lit air that separated his chest from hers, and she thought times this is dangerous, this awareness, this awakening asterisk, even as her feet followed his lead with a grace she had not known she possessed. As if her body understood something her mind refused to acknowledge. He moved beautifully, she realized with some surprise. This cold Duke, who seemed carved from winter itself, moved with a fluid power that spoke of years of training and an innate physical mastery. And when he turned her beneath the glittering chandeliers, when the room spun into a blur of color and light around them, she felt for one dizzying moment as though they were the only 2 souls in existence, suspended in this pocket of music and motion, and his voice came low near her ear, breaking the spell even as it wove a new one. "You dance better than your gown would suggest. Miss Ashford, wherever did an impoverished gentlewoman learn such skill?" The barb would have wounded had she not caught something beneath it, a curiosity he could not quite conceal, an attention he had not intended to give, and so she answered, with her chin lifted and her eyes meeting his. "The same place I learned to endure the company of rude gentlemen. Your Grace necessity is an excellent instructor." Something flickered in those dark eyes, surprise, yes, but also something else, something that might have been respect, if such a frozen heart could harbor such warmth, and his hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist, as he guided her through a turn more complex than strictly necessary, testing her, she realized, pushing to find the limits of her capability, and when she matched him step for step, when she refused to stumble or falter or look away from his challenging gaze, she saw the first crack appear in his armor of indifference, saw curiosity kindle where boredom had reigned, and he said, so quietly that only she could hear beneath the swell of violins, "You are not what I expected, Miss Ashford," and she replied, breathless now from more than exertion, "I find, Your Grace, that expectations are merely disappointments waiting to happen." And when he almost smiled, when the corner of his stern mouth twitched with something that might have been amusement in a man capable of such emotion, Eleanor felt triumph and terror in equal measure, because she had done the impossible. She had captured his attention, and now she must somehow survive the having of it. The waltz ended as all waltzes must, with a final flourish of strings and the reluctant release of bodies that had, for 3 minutes and an eternity, Moved as one, he stepped back from her with a bow so correct it bordered on mockery, and she curtsied with a grace born of desperation and something else, something new that fluttered in her chest like a caged bird sensing an open window. And then he was gone, melting into the crowd as though their dance had meant nothing, as though she had not felt the quickening of his pulse beneath her fingertips, as though the air between them had not grown thick with unspoken questions. And Eleanor returned to the margins where she belonged, to the shadows along the wall where wallflowers wilted in quiet obscurity. But she found she could not stop trembling, could not quiet the riot of sensation and confusion that their brief contact had awakened, and she thought, times it is done. I have failed. One dance was all I could secure, and it was not enough. Could never be enough. Asterisk. And yet, as the hours crawled past, as the candles burned lower, and the musicians grew weary, and the glittering guests continued their endless parade of gossip and ambition, Eleanor became aware of something strange, something that raised the fine hairs on the back of her neck and sent her heart into fresh paroxysms of uncertainty. He was watching her, the Duke of Shadows, the man of ice and indifference. She would glance up from her position by the potted palms and find his dark gaze already upon her, would turn from a murmured conversation with her aunt and catch him looking away too quickly, would move through the room on some small errand and sense his attention following her, like the pull of the moon upon the tide. And each time their eyes met across that vast ballroom, each time that thread of invisible connection drew taut between them, she saw confusion warring with something fiercer in his expression, saw a man at battle with himself over an enemy he had not anticipated. And when the great clock in the hallway began to toll midnight, its sonorous chimes cutting through the chatter, and music like a pronouncement of fate, Eleanor stepped through the glass doors onto the terrace for a moment of cold air and solitude, needing to breathe, needing to think, needing to understand what was happening to her carefully constructed plans. The winter air bit at her exposed skin, frost glittered on the stone balustrade like scattered diamonds, and above her the stars burned cold and distant in a sky of deepest velvet, and she was so lost in contemplation of that infinite darkness that she did not hear his footsteps until he was already there, already beside her, already speaking in that low voice that seemed to resonate somewhere deep in her chest. "Who are you, Miss Ashford?" And she turned to find him close, closer than propriety allowed, his breath misting in the frigid air, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in years, truly seen, and she answered with the only honesty she had left, "I am no one, Your Grace, a ghost at the feast, a name that will never appear in the society pages." But he shook his head, something almost like frustration crossing those stern features. "No, that is what you show them, what you want them to believe. I am asking who you truly are, beneath the mask, beneath the shabby gown, and the perfect manners, and those eyes that hold far too many secrets for a simple country wallflower." And in that moment, standing in the frozen darkness with this impossible man demanding impossible truths, Eleanor felt the first crack form in her own carefully constructed armor, and she whispered, "Perhaps, Your Grace, I am simply someone who recognizes a fellow prisoner when she sees one." The silence stretched between them like the frozen expanse of a winter lake, fragile and treacherous, and Eleanor watched as something shifted behind the Duke's dark eyes, some calculation or decision taking shape in the depths of that unfathomable gaze, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its demanding edge, replaced by something more measured, more deliberate, the tone of a man accustomed to negotiating treaties and settling matters of grave consequence. "You speak of prisoners, Miss Ashford, and perhaps you are more perceptive than I credited. We are both, it seems, trapped by circumstances beyond our choosing, you by your family's misfortunes, and I by obligations I can no longer ignore." And Eleanor felt her breath catch, felt the cold air crystallize in her lungs as she understood that something monumental was unfolding, that this conversation on this frozen terrace was about to alter the course of her existence, and she remained silent, waiting, watching the battle play out across his stern features as he continued. "My grandmother lies dying at Ravensmoor Hall, and her final wish, her demand, rather, for she has never learned to simply wish, is to see me wed before she departs this world. To know the title secured, the legacy continued, and I have resisted this pressure for 5 years, have refused every simpering debutante and calculating widow thrust before me, because He stopped, his jaw tightening, and Eleanor saw pain flicker across his face like lightning illuminating a darkened landscape before he mastered himself once more. Because I had no intention of ever binding another soul to mine, but circumstances, Miss Ashford, have a way of forcing our hands, and so I find myself in need of a wife, a practical arrangement, nothing more, and you find yourself in need of salvation from whatever ruin sends you hunting dukes at winter balls. And the cruelty of his words should have wounded her, would have wounded her had she not heard beneath them a strange and desperate honesty, an acknowledgement that they were both survivors doing what they must to endure. And he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the individual snowflakes caught in his dark hair, could count the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and private torments. I am proposing an arrangement, Miss Ashford, a formal courtship leading to marriage, conducted with all propriety and public approval, your family's debts discharged, your mother's care secured, your reputation elevated beyond reproach, and in return, I receive a wife who expects nothing from me, no tender emotions, no romantic declarations, no claim upon a heart I no longer possess, simply a practical partnership between two people who understand that love is a luxury neither of us can afford. And Eleanor felt the weight of his proposition settle upon her shoulders like a mantle of ice and iron, felt the future forking before her into two distinct paths, one leading back to ruin and poverty and her mother's quiet suffering, the other leading into the unknown darkness of life, bound to this wounded, dangerous, inexplicably compelling man, and she thought of her father's shame and her mother's medicine, and the creditors circling like vultures, thought of the aunt who had risked everything to bring her here tonight, thought of the life she had imagined for herself as a girl, full of poetry and passion and love freely given, and she let that dream go like a paper boat released upon a stream, watched it float away into the darkness, and lifted her chin to meet his gaze with all the dignity she possessed. "Very well, Your Grace, I accept your terms." The weeks that followed moved with the sluggish inevitability of winter itself, each day dawning grey and cold, each evening descending into darkness that seemed to seep into the very bones of the world, and Eleanor found herself caught in a strange purgatory between her old life and whatever uncertain future awaited her as the Duke of Ravensmoor's intended bride. The formal announcement had appeared in the papers, that stark proclamation of their arrangement, rendered in black ink, that made her pulse race with equal measures of relief and terror whenever she glimpsed it, and society had responded with precisely the shocked fascination Alexander had predicted, invitations arriving at her aunt's modest townhouse like a sudden flood after years of drought, doors that had been firmly closed now swinging open to admit the future Duchess of Ravensmoor, and through it all Eleanor performed her role with careful precision, attending teas and musicales and afternoon calls with the brittle smile of a woman walking across thin ice, always aware of the vast cold depths waiting beneath should she make a single misstep, and the Duke himself proved an enigma wrapped in formality, appearing at her side for the requisite public outings with clockwork regularity, his carriage arriving at precisely the appointed hour, his conversation consisting largely of pleasantries so carefully constructed they might have been rehearsed, and during those first stilted encounters, Eleanor studied him as she might study a text in a foreign language, searching for meaning in the spaces between words, in the slight tensing of his jaw when someone mentioned his family, in the way his dark eyes would sometimes grow distant, as though he had retreated to some interior landscape where she could not follow, and she began to notice small things, insignificant details that accumulated like snowflakes building towards something larger. The way he always thanked servants by name, remembering the footman who had held his coat and the maid who had brought refreshments, the way his expression would soften almost imperceptibly when they passed a bookshop, his gaze lingering on the displays in the window, the way he had once, during a particularly tedious afternoon call, caught her stifling a yawn and responded with the ghost of something that might have been amusement flickering at the corner of his stern mouth. And he, too, she realized, was watching her, cataloguing her own small truths. She caught him, observing her one afternoon as she stood before a shelf of poetry in Lady Whitmore's drawing-room, her fingers tracing the spine of a volume of Keats with something like hunger, and the following week a package arrived at her aunt's house containing that very edition, wrapped in brown paper with no note attached, and Eleanor had held it in her trembling hands, understanding that this cold, distant man had noticed something true about her, had seen past her careful performance to glimpse the girl who had once dreamed of nothing but words and beauty, before the world had taught her that such dreams were luxuries she could not afford, and she pressed the book to her chest, and thought, "Times perhaps there is more to this arrangement than either of us anticipated **." And outside the window the winter wind howled on, but somewhere deep beneath the frozen ground, invisible and patient, seeds were beginning to stir. It happened on a morning when February's grip had begun to loosen, when the first tentative suggestions of thaw sent rivulets of snowmelt trickling down window panes, and the air carried something almost like the memory of warmth, and Eleanor had ventured out alone to walk in the small park near her aunt's townhouse, craving solitude and the simple pleasure of movement, after too many hours spent in drawing rooms, performing the role of eager bride-to-be. And she had wandered further than she intended, her thoughts drifting like the scattered clouds overhead, when she found herself at the edge of the old churchyard that bordered the park's eastern boundary, a place of ancient stones and winter-bare trees and silence so profound it seemed to hum against her ears. And it was there, among the weathered monuments, to lives long concluded, that she saw him, Alexander, the Duke of Ravensmoor, her betrothed, that man of ice and iron who had never once in their weeks of formal courtship allowed her to glimpse anything beyond his carefully constructed facade, and he was kneeling in the frozen grass before a white marble angel, his dark head bowed, his shoulders curved inward, as though he were trying to contain something too vast for his body to hold, and Eleanor's breath stopped in her throat as she understood with sudden, devastating clarity that she was witnessing something never meant for other eyes, something private and sacred and raw, and she should have turned away, should have retreated silently back the way she had come, but her feet remained rooted to the frost-hardened earth as she watched this proud, cold man press his gloveless hand against the marble, as though he could somehow reach through stone to touch whatever lay beneath. And then he spoke, his voice carrying across the still air in fragments. She could barely discern, "Forgive me, and should have been there, and never meant." And the grief in those broken words was so acute, so utterly unguarded, that Eleanor felt tears prick her own eyes, felt her heart crack open with a compassion she had not known she possessed for this impossible man, and perhaps she made some sound, some small intake of breath or rustle of fabric, because suddenly his head snapped up and his eyes found hers across the distance between them, and she watched his face transform the grief, vanishing beneath a wave of fury so intense it seemed to change the very air around him, and he rose to his feet with predatory swiftness, striding toward her with murder in his gaze. "What are you doing here? How dare you follow me? How dare you spy upon?" And his voice cracked, actually cracked, and Eleanor stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to flee, and she said quietly, "I did not follow you, Your Grace. I was walking, and I stumbled upon. I am sorry. I should not have stayed. I should not have watched. But I—" and she paused, gathering her courage like armor around her. "I know something of grief, of kneeling before stones that cannot answer, of speaking to those who can no longer hear, and I know the rage that comes when someone witnesses what we wish to keep hidden." And he stared at her, his chest heaving, his dark eyes wild with something that was no longer quite anger, and Eleanor added softly, "You do not have to tell me who lies there, but please know that whatever masks we wear for the world, I will not judge you for the truth beneath them." Something shifted after that morning in the churchyard, some invisible barrier cracking like ice beneath the first true warmth of approaching spring. And though Alexander never spoke directly of what Eleanor had witnessed, though he never named the white marble angel or the grief that had brought him to his knees, there emerged between them a new quality of silence, not the awkward emptiness of their early acquaintance, but something richer, a silence that acknowledged shared understanding. And in the weeks that followed, as February surrendered to March, and the world began its slow exhale toward warmth, Eleanor found that her betrothed had begun to change in ways so subtle she might have missed them, had she not been watching with the careful attention of a woman who had staked everything on learning to read this enigmatic man. And it began with books, more books, appearing at her aunt's townhouse with increasing frequency, first editions and rare volumes, and obscure collections of verse that spoke to tastes she had barely acknowledged possessing, as though Alexander had somehow mapped the landscape of her literary heart, and was determined to furnish it with treasures she had never dared to want. And when she thanked him during their afternoon drives, he would merely incline his head and murmur that he had happened upon them, as though chance rather than intention had guided his hand. But Eleanor saw the truth in the way his dark eyes would watch her face as she opened each package, hungry for her reaction, though he would never admit to such hunger, and she began to reciprocate in her own quiet way, learning the small gestures that might ease his perpetual tension, ordering his preferred tea before he arrived for their meetings, mentioning an article she had read about agricultural innovations that she thought might interest the master of vast estates, asking questions about Ravensmoor itself, and watching how his expression would soften almost imperceptibly when he spoke of the land he loved. And one afternoon in Lady Pemberton's drawing-room, surrounded by the cream of society, all pretending not to observe their every interaction, Eleanor made some dry observation about the tedium of watercolour painting, the only acceptable artistic pursuit for young ladies of quality, and Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravensmoor, that man of ice and iron and impenetrable reserve, laughed, a sound so unexpected and so genuine that several nearby matrons actually startled, and Eleanor felt something bloom in her chest, warm and dangerous and utterly beyond her control, and their verbal sparring, which had once been edged with genuine antagonism, began to transform into something that resembled play, thrust and parry that left them both almost breathless with something that was not quite anger. And Eleanor would catch herself thinking of clever things to say to him during the long hours between their meetings, would find her lips curving at some private joke only he would understand, and she recognized with growing terror that she was beginning to feel something far more complicated than gratitude toward this impossible, wounded, slowly thawing man. And as the first crocuses pushed through the softening earth and the days stretched longer and the world remembered how to hope, Eleanor Ashford admitted to herself in the quiet darkness of her modest bedroom that she was in very grave danger indeed, for her heart, that traitorous organ she had thought safely armored behind practical necessity, had begun to want things that were never part of their arrangement. The whispers began, as such things always do, softly, insidiously, spreading through ballrooms and drawing-rooms like smoke through silk, and Eleanor first became aware of them at Lady Ashworth's musical, when she noticed how certain conversations would falter as she approached, how fans would rise to conceal mouths curved with malicious pleasure, how eyes would slide toward her with that particular gleam that signified someone else's misfortune being savoured like a rare delicacy, and it was Mrs. Hendricks, that reliable conduit of society's cruelest observations, who finally enlightened her with poisonous sweetness. "My dear Miss Ashford, how brave you are to show your face when everyone is saying such dreadful things about your family's circumstances, about how you quite threw yourself at the Duke at Thornwood Manor, about how your father's debts are so extensive that you had no choice but to pursue a man so far above your station," and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, even as she forced her expression to remain serene, even as she murmured something appropriately dismissive, and moved away on legs that trembled beneath her modest gown, and she soon discovered the source of these venomous rumours. Lady Cassandra Whitmore, golden-haired and exquisite, and possessed of a dowry that could purchase small kingdoms, who had apparently set her sights upon the Duke of Ravensmoor long before Eleanor had stumbled into his orbit, and who now regarded Eleanor with the kind of hatred that beautiful women reserve for those who have stolen what they consider rightfully theirs. And as if the whispers were not torment enough, there appeared suddenly in Eleanor's sphere a new complication in the form of Lord Sebastian Ashworth, charming and handsome, and possessed of an easy smile that seemed designed to make women forget their better judgment, and he began to pay Eleanor particular attention, seeking her out at every gathering, showering her with compliments that felt like honey poured over something rotten, and Eleanor understood with weary clarity that his interest was not genuine, but rather calculated to provoke the Duke, to test the strength of their arrangement, to create scandal where scandal would wound most deeply. And she watched Alexander observe these developments with an expression that had grown increasingly thunderous, watched his jaw tighten when Lord Ashworth bent too close to her ear, watched his hands clench into fists when Lady Cassandra would sweep past with some cutting remark disguised as concern, and one evening, after Lord Ashworth had been particularly persistent in his attentions, Alexander materialized at Eleanor's side with such sudden intensity that she actually startled, and he said in a voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, "That man will not speak to you again. and there was something in his tone, something possessive and protective, and utterly at odds with their supposedly practical arrangement, that made Eleanor's heart stutter in her chest, and she found herself saying, "I am quite capable of managing unwanted attention, Your Grace." And he looked at her with those dark eyes that had begun to haunt her dreams, and replied, "I have no doubt of your capabilities, Miss Ashford, but you should not have to manage alone." And in that moment, surrounded by whispers and warnings and the weight of society's judgment, Eleanor understood that whatever walls remained between them were crumbling faster than either of them had anticipated. The spring ball at Hartwick House arrived on an evening when the air itself seemed heavy with promise, when the first true warmth of the season had coaxed open the gardens and filled the ballroom with the fragrance of lilacs and something sweeter, something that whispered of new beginnings, and Eleanor stood at the threshold of that glittering chamber in a gown of pale blue silk, a gift from Alexander that she had initially refused and then accepted, when she saw something in his expression that looked almost like hope, and she felt the weight of every gaze that turned toward her, felt the whispers that followed her like shadows. But tonight, for reasons she could not quite name, she found she did not care. For tonight Alexander Blackwood stood across the room watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and her pulse quicken, and her carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble entirely, and when he crossed the floor toward her, the crowd seemed to part before him like water before a ship's prow, and he extended his hand without a word, without the formal request that propriety demanded, simply held out his hand as though he had every right to claim her, as though there had never been any question that she would place her fingers in his, and she did. God help her, she did. And he led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began a waltz, and this time everything was different, for his hand at her waist was not merely correct but possessive, his fingers threading through hers with an intimacy that sent heat blooming through her entire body. And when she looked up into his dark eyes, she saw something there that stole her voice, something raw and hungry and desperate that he was no longer entirely able to conceal, and they moved together as though they had been dancing this way for centuries, as though their bodies had always known this rhythm, and he said quietly, "They are all watching," and she replied, "I know," and he said, "Does it trouble you?" And she answered, "It should," and something flickered across his face, something that might have been amusement or might have been triumph, and he pulled her slightly closer than was proper, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the layers of silk and linen that separated them, and he murmured against her hair, "You are magnificent, Eleanor Ashford," and her name in his mouth, her Christian name, spoken with such rough tenderness, undid something within her, some final defense she had not even known she was maintaining, and she whispered back, "Alexander," just his name, nothing more, but she felt the shudder that ran through him at the sound of it, felt his hand tighten at her waist, and around them the world continued to turn. The candles continued to glitter, the gossips continued to observe and judge and speculate, but Eleanor was aware of none of it, aware only of this man who had demanded one dance and somehow claimed everything. And when the music finally faded and they stood together in the sudden silence, neither of them moved, neither of them stepped back into the safe distance that propriety required, and Eleanor understood with crystalline clarity that they had crossed some invisible threshold from which there could be no retreat, and the terror of that knowledge was matched only by the desperate, undeniable joy. It was Lady Cassandra Whitmore, of all people, who delivered the blow that would shatter Eleanor's fragile happiness, approaching her at a garden party 3 days after the spring ball, with a smile that glittered like broken glass and a voice pitched to carry just far enough, saying, "I do hope you know what you are getting yourself into, Miss Ashford, marrying a man who killed his own sister," and Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, felt the ground shift beneath her feet, even as she maintained her composure and replied coolly, "I have no idea what you mean," but Lady Cassandra's smile only widened as she continued, "Oh, but surely he has told you about poor Lady Charlotte, how she begged him to take her to London for the season, how he refused because he was too busy with his own pleasures, how she took a carriage alone against his explicit orders and was killed when the horses spooked on the icy road, how they found her body in the snow with his letter of refusal still clutched in her frozen hand, and something in Eleanor's expression must have betrayed her shock, because Lady Cassandra laughed, a crystalline sound devoid of warmth, and added, "I see he has kept his secrets well, But then again, what man would confess to killing the only person he ever loved? And Eleanor walked away on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, her mind reeling with this terrible knowledge, remembering now the grave she had seen him kneeling before, the raw grief in his voice when he had spoken of loss, the way he flinched whenever anyone mentioned family. And she understood suddenly the true nature of the walls he had built, understood that they were not merely protection against the world, but punishment, a prison of his own making where he served an endless sentence for a crime that existed only in his own tortured conscience. And she knew she should go to him, should seek the truth from his own lips, but some desperate part of her needed to know first, needed to understand what she was facing, and so she found herself in his study that evening under the pretense of returning a book, and there on his desk, left carelessly open, as though he had been reading it, recently was a letter in a feminine hand, dated 4 years past, and Eleanor knew she should not read it, knew it was a violation of everything decent, but her hands moved of their own accord, and the words that met her eyes were like knives. "Dearest Alexander, I understand that your business keeps you in London, but I am so desperately lonely here at Ravensmoor, and if you will not come to me, then I must come to you. For I cannot bear another winter in this tomb of a house without your company, your loving sister Charlotte," and beneath it, in Alexander's bold hand, a reply never sent. "Charlotte, you must not travel in this weather. The roads are treacherous. Wait until spring and I will come for you myself." And Eleanor understood then the full horror of it he had written, the words that might have saved her but had never sent them, had chosen instead a curt refusal that had driven his sister to her death, and when she looked up, Alexander was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of such devastating anguish that she could not speak, could not move, could only stand there with his secrets exposed between them like a wound that would never heal, and he said, in a voice she had never heard before, broken and hollow and ancient with grief, "Now you know what manner of monster you have agreed to marry." The silence that followed his words stretched between them like a chasm, vast and terrible, and Eleanor watched as Alexander's face shuttered completely, watched as he retreated behind walls so thick and so cold that the man who had held her on the dance floor, who had whispered her name like a prayer, seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by the Duke of Ravensmoor, the man society called heartless. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was ice, was stone, was everything designed to wound, saying, "You should leave now. Miss Ashford, take whatever settlement you require to satisfy your family's debts, and forget you ever knew me. For I assure you, any connection to me will only bring you grief." And Eleanor felt something rise within her, something fierce and burning that she had not known she possessed, and she said, "No," just that single word, but it seemed to strike him like a blow, and he laughed, a terrible sound devoid of all mirth, and said, "You do not understand. I destroy everything I touch, everyone I love. Charlotte trusted me, and I failed her. I killed her with my carelessness, with my selfishness, with my inability to simply write the words that would have kept her safe," and his voice cracked on the last word, cracked and broke like ice on a spring river. And Eleanor stepped toward him, even as he stepped back, pursued him across the study, as though they were engaged in some desperate dance. And she said, "You did not kill her, Alexander. You made a choice you regret, a terrible choice that had terrible consequences. But the ice that frightened those horses, the storm that made the roads treacherous, those were not your doing." And he turned on her then with something like fury, like desperation, and said, "You speak of things you do not understand. You did not see her body, you did not hold her cold hand, and know that if you had only written different words, if you had only been less consumed with your own pleasures, she would still be alive, laughing and bright and everything good that I am not." And Eleanor's eyes burned with tears. She refused to shed, and she said, "And so you have spent 4 years punishing yourself, building walls so high that no one can reach you, convincing yourself that you deserve to be alone, to be unloved, to suffer eternally for a single moment of failure." And something flickered across his face, something raw and wounded and desperately young, and he said, "You should hate me, you should fear me. Why do you not run from me like everyone else?" And Eleanor stood her ground, stood in the center of his study with the letter still clutched in her trembling hand, and she said words that cost her everything, words that left her as exposed and vulnerable as he was. "Because I love you, you impossible, infuriating, self-destructive man. I love you, and I will not let you push me away. I will not let you use your guilt as a shield against the possibility of happiness." And Alexander stared at her as though she had struck him, as though she had reached into his chest and seized his heart. And for one endless moment Eleanor thought she had broken through, but then his expression hardened, and he said in a voice of perfect, terrible calm, "Then you are a fool, Eleanor Ashford, and I will not be responsible for destroying you too." And he walked past her and out of the room, leaving her standing alone among his secrets, her declaration of love hanging in the empty air like the final note of a song no one had asked to hear. The hours that followed Alexander's departure stretched before Eleanor like a vast and trackless wilderness, and she remained standing in his study long after the sound of his footsteps had faded, long after the candles had guttered low and the fire had collapsed into embers, her mind a tempest of conflicting thoughts, and her heart a battlefield where fear and love waged their ancient war. And when at last she moved, it was as though her body belonged to a stranger, carrying her through the darkened corridors of Ravensmoor to the small guest chamber she had been given during her visits, and there, in the cold quiet of the night, she sat upon the window seat and stared out at the moonlit gardens, and asked herself the question that had haunted her since childhood, the question she had never had the courage to answer. What do you truly want, Eleanor Ashford? Not what your family needs, not what society expects, not what duty demands, but what does your own wounded heart desire? And the answer that rose within her was terrifying in its simplicity, terrifying because it meant risking everything, meant opening herself to pain that could destroy her far more thoroughly than poverty or scandal ever could. For she wanted him, wanted Alexander Blackwood with all his shadows and his grief and his terrible conviction that he was unworthy of love, wanted to spend her life proving to him that redemption was not something to be earned through suffering, but something to be accepted through grace. And yet even as this truth crystallized within her, she felt the old fears stirring, the fears that had kept her small and silent and invisible for so many years, the voice that whispered she was not enough, could never be enough, that a plain and penniless wallflower had no business loving a duke, no right to believe she could heal wounds that had festered for years. And she remembered her father's face when the creditors came, remembered her mother's illness and her aunt's desperate machinations, remembered all the ways she had learned to make herself less, to want less, to expect nothing so that she could never be disappointed, and she understood suddenly that Alexander was not the only one who had built walls, not the only one who used armor to protect a heart too tender for the world's cruelties, and the recognition struck her with the force of revelation, for she had told him he was using guilt as a shield, and yet was she not using duty the same way, hiding behind obligation and necessity so that she never had to admit she wanted something for herself, never had to risk the devastating vulnerability of reaching for happiness and finding it beyond her grasp? And as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor felt something shift within her, something fundamental and irreversible, and she made a choice that terrified her more than anything she had ever done, more than approaching the Duke at that first ball, more than agreeing to his cold proposition, more than confessing her love to a man determined to reject it. She chose to fight, not with anger or demands, but with the quiet, fierce persistence of spring breaking through frozen ground, and she rose from the window seat with a new resolve burning in her chest, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult, knowing that Alexander would resist and rage and try to drive her away, but knowing too that some loves were worth every wound they cost, and that she would rather spend a lifetime being pushed away by a man she loved than accept a safe and colorless existence without him. She found him 3 days later, 3 days during which she had refused to leave Ravensmoor despite his absence, despite the servants' pitying glances and her aunt's increasingly frantic letters demanding to know what had transpired. 3 days during which she had haunted the halls of his ancestral home like a ghost herself, waiting and praying and holding fast to the resolve that had crystallized within her on that long and sleepless night. And when at last Alexander returned, he looked as though he had not slept at all, his dark hair disheveled and his jaw shadowed with stubble, and his eyes bearing the hollow look of a man who had fled his demons only to discover they traveled with him wherever he went, and Eleanor intercepted him in the great hall before he could retreat to some distant corner of the estate, stepped directly into his path, with her heart hammering against her ribs and her hands trembling at her sides, and he stopped short at the sight of her, something flickering across his ravaged features that might have been hope or might have been despair, and he said in a voice rough with exhaustion, "You are still here," and she said, "I will always be here," and he closed his eyes as though her words caused him physical pain and said, "Eleanor, I have given you every reason to leave. I have shown you the blackness of my soul. I have told you I will destroy you. Why do you persist in this madness?" And Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the fine lines of suffering around his eyes and the way his hands clenched at his sides as though he was fighting the urge to reach for her. And she said, "Because I have a confession to make, one I should have made long ago if I had possessed the courage." And she took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness and said, "When I first agreed to your arrangement, I told myself it was for my family, for duty, for survival, and perhaps it was, but somewhere in the weeks that followed, somewhere between the books you brought me and the almost smiles I earned, and the way you looked at me, as though I was the first real thing you had seen in years, everything changed. And I am not marrying you for money, Alexander. I am not marrying you for security or to satisfy family obligation, or because I have no other choice. I am marrying you because when I imagine a life without you in it, the world turns grey and cold and utterly without meaning. I am marrying you because I love you, not the Duke of Ravensmore, but Alexander Blackwood, the man who carries guilt like a stone around his neck, the man who is so terrified of love that he would rather be alone forever than risk another loss. And I know you will try to push me away again. I know you will tell me I am foolish and that you will ruin me. But I am done being small and silent and invisible. I am done hiding behind duty when the truth is so much simpler and so much more terrifying." And Alexander stared at her with something breaking open behind his eyes, and his voice was barely a whisper when he said, "You cannot mean this." And Eleanor reached up and laid her palm against his cheek, feeling the roughness of stubble beneath her fingertips and the way he trembled at her touch. And she said, "I have never meant anything more in my entire life." And she watched as the last of his resistance crumbled, watched as the walls he had built over 4 long years of grief came tumbling down like a fortress before a siege of patience and unwavering love. And Alexander made a sound that was half sob and half prayer, and pulled her into his arms and buried his face in her hair, and held her as though she was the only solid thing in a world that had lost all meaning, and against her temple he whispered, "I do not deserve you." And Eleanor held him just as tightly and whispered back, "Then let me love you until you believe you do." They stood there in the great hall for what felt like an eternity, wrapped in each other's arms, as the morning light streamed through the tall windows and painted golden patterns across the ancient stone floor. And when at last Alexander lifted his head and looked down at Eleanor, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear, clearer than she had ever seen them, as though some terrible fog had finally lifted from his soul, and he said, "Come with me. There is something I need to show you, something I need to tell you properly." And he took her hand and led her through the corridors of Ravensmore until they reached a part of the house she had never seen, a wing that had clearly been closed off for years, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that penetrated the heavy curtains. And he pushed open a door to reveal a room that had obviously belonged to a young woman, preserved exactly as it must have been 4 years ago, watercolors still pinned to the walls, and books still stacked beside the bed, and a half-finished embroidery still stretched in its frame by the window. And Alexander's voice was soft as he said, "This was Cecily's room. I have not allowed anyone to enter since the day she died, not even the servants to clean. I thought if I kept it exactly as she left it, then some part of her would remain. But I understand now that I was not preserving her memory. I was preserving my guilt, keeping it fresh and sharp so I could punish myself with it every day." And he told Eleanor everything then, told her about the night Cecily had begged him to escort her to a house party, and how he had refused because he had more important things to do, told her about the carriage accident on the rain-slicked roads and how he had not been there to protect her, told her about the messenger who arrived at dawn with news that shattered his world. And Eleanor listened without interruption, her hand still clasped in his, and when he finished she said quietly, "Now let me tell you about the day my father came home with ruin in his eyes. The day I learned that the man I had worshipped was flawed and broken and human, and how I spent years trying to be perfect enough to fix what he had destroyed, trying to be invisible enough that I would never be a burden, trying to be small enough that I would never want anything for myself." And she told him about her mother's illness and her aunt's schemes and the terror she had carried to that first ball. the terror of failing everyone who depended on her, and Alexander listened with the same grave attention she had given him, and when she finished, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her palm and said, "We are quite a pair, are we not? Two wounded creatures who built walls so high we nearly imprisoned ourselves forever." And Eleanor smiled through the tears that had gathered in her eyes and said, "But walls can be dismantled, stone by stone, and prisons can become homes if we are brave enough to let the light in." And Alexander pulled her close once more and whispered against her hair, "Stay with me, Eleanor, not because of any arrangement, not because of duty or obligation, but because I love you, because I have loved you since you looked at me across that ballroom and refused to be afraid. Stay with me and teach me how to live again." And Eleanor lifted her face to his and said simply, "Always." 3 years had passed since that morning in Cecily's room, 3 years that had transformed Ravensmoor from a mausoleum of grief into something it had perhaps never been, even in its finest days, a home alive with warmth and laughter and the particular chaos that accompanies small children. And on this particular autumn afternoon, Eleanor stood at the window of the nursery watching the leaves drift golden and crimson across the grounds, while behind her 2-year-old Catherine attempted to stack wooden blocks into towers that her infant brother James seemed determined to topple from his position on the carpet, his chubby hands reaching with gleeful destruction toward his sister's careful constructions. And Eleanor smiled at the familiar sounds of Catherine's indignant protests and James's delighted gurgling, sounds that filled the spaces of this ancient house like music. And she thought of how different everything was now, how the corridors that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the patter of small feet and the endless questions of a curious toddler, and the warmth of a family knitting itself together day by ordinary day. And as if summoned by her thoughts, Alexander appeared in the doorway, still bearing traces of the estate business that had occupied his morning, but with his cravat loosened and his severe expression softening. The moment his eyes found his children, and Catherine abandoned her blocks immediately and ran to him crying, "Papa," with the absolute confidence of a child who has never known anything but adoration. And Alexander swept her up into his arms and pressed a kiss to her dark curls, so like his own, and carried her to where Eleanor stood, his free hand finding the small of his wife's back with the easy intimacy of long familiarity. And he said quietly, "I found something today, in the attic, my mother's old journals from when Cecily and I were young." And Eleanor heard what he did not say, heard the significance of a man who could now speak his sister's name without flinching, who had learned to hold grief and joy in the same heart, without one consuming the other. And she leaned into his warmth and said, "Will you read them to me tonight?" And he nodded and looked out at the autumn landscape and said, "She would have loved you. You know, she would have loved all of this." And Eleanor reached up to touch his cheek, that gesture that had become their private language, and said, "I know, and I think perhaps she does. Wherever she is, I think she knows you finally found your way home." And Alexander turned his head to press a kiss against her palm, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of feeling that still stole her breath even after 3 years of marriage and 2 children and countless ordinary days. And Catherine chose that moment to demand attention by grabbing her father's face between her small hands and announcing that she was hungry. And James began to fuss for his mother, and the intimate moment dissolved into the beautiful mundane chaos of family life. And yet as Eleanor gathered her son into her arms and watched Alexander carry their daughter toward the door, already negotiating about biscuits before supper, she felt her heart swell with a gratitude so profound it bordered on reverence, for she had walked into a winter ballroom expecting nothing but duty and sacrifice, and had somehow found her way to this, to autumn light and children's laughter, and a love that had grown stronger for having been tested. And she understood at last that the coldest winters always give way to spring, if only we have courage enough to wait for the thaw. Dear listener, as we draw the curtains closed on this tale of frost and thaw, of walls built high and love patient enough to scale them, perhaps you find yourself thinking of the barriers in your own heart, the fortifications you have constructed stone by careful stone against the possibility of pain. And if so, I would ask you to consider what you have witnessed here, how a man so consumed by guilt that he had forgotten how to feel anything but cold chose punishment over healing, because punishment felt deserved, while healing felt like betrayal, how a woman so accustomed to invisibility that she had forgotten her own worth nearly sacrificed herself on the altar of duty, before discovering that she too deserved to be seen and cherished and loved, and perhaps you recognize something of yourself in their struggle. Perhaps you too have stood in ballrooms, both literal and metaphorical, wearing masks so carefully crafted that you have forgotten the face beneath. Perhaps you too have convinced yourself that the walls protecting you from pain are also protecting others from the burden of knowing you. But here is the truth that Eleanor and Alexander discovered through their long winter of the soul. The walls we build from grief and shame and fear do not protect us. They imprison us. They keep out not only pain but also joy, not only rejection but also acceptance, not only the risk of love but also its incomparable reward. And yes, to lower those walls is to invite vulnerability, to stand exposed before another human heart, with all your wounds visible and all your imperfections on display. But it is also to discover that you are not alone in your brokenness, that every soul carries its secret griefs and hidden shames, and that the bravest thing we can do is not to pretend we are whole, but to offer our fractured selves to another and trust them to hold us gently. So if there is someone in your life who stands behind their own fortress of solitude, someone whose coldness you suspect masks a deeper pain, I would encourage you to be patient, to be present, to offer not judgment but understanding, for you cannot force another person to lower their walls. You can only demonstrate through your constancy that safety exists beyond them. And if it is you who stands imprisoned behind stone of your own making, then know this: it is never too late to begin the slow work of dismantling what you have built, never too late to reach one trembling hand through the gap and allow another to take it. The ice that seems so permanent is only water waiting to remember how to flow, and spring comes even to the coldest hearts if we have courage enough to let it in. So go gently into whatever remains of your day. Carry with you the knowledge that transformation is possible, that love is patient, that even the Duke of Shadows found his way into the light, and may you find warmth waiting wherever you least expect it. May you have the courage to dance when the music begins. And may you rest tonight in the quiet certainty that you too are worthy of the kind of love that thaws every frozen thing.